Following the 2024 presidential election, rumors began circulating online that key parts of the digital election infrastructure across the country were hacked to alter the election results in favor of now President Donald Trump. Early speculation began emerging by the time Trump had been announced the winner that Elon Musk had used Starlink internet satellites to access supposedly internet connected voting machines. In the following weeks, there were a series of open letters published by election and cybersecurity experts detailing concerns about the integrity of this year's election. There's a broad range of claims regarding election interference, some of which are plausible, but as things go on the internet, there's also a lot of verifiably false speculation on social media. Before we get to evaluating the validity of various claims, we'll start with an overview of election security principles. It's important that we have a clear idea of what it actually means to have free, fair, and secure elections and how election procedures are designed to support that. Since the bulk of speculation about interference in our last election revolves around the use of digital voting machines, we should also have a thorough understanding of the security concerns at play in that technology. With that background, we can unpack the breadth of claims that have been made about the integrity of our most recent elections and some of the news reporting surrounding those claims. Whatever the reality is of our last election and what conclusions you choose to draw, this makes a fascinating case study on how the social internet shapes the spread of information and is useful for reflecting on how we look for hope in a world that seems to just keep getting worse. To understand how things can be broken, we first need to have a picture of what it looks like to work correctly. If we want to understand how elections can be disrupted, we need to start by understanding what the election process looks like when working as intended. When we think about features that we want to have in our election process, the first that would come to mind for most of us, I think, is that an election's outcome should always generally match the intent of voters. That's what the term election integrity refers to. And even though we might consider it to be the most important feature, that's the whole point of democracy after all, it's not the only important characteristic of secure elections. The other pillars are ballot secrecy, voter authentication, voter enfranchisement, and availability. Election integrity seems fairly straightforward. If a voter casts their ballot for a particular candidate, then that should correspond with one vote for that candidate. But there are a few ways that gets a little tricky, which is where the idea of voter intent comes in. There are a few different circumstances that might cause the selection on their ballot not to match the candidate they intended to vote for. For example, if their ballot was filled out incorrectly, maybe they were confused about the layout and marked the wrong box. Another possibility is that they could be forced to cast a vote for a candidate that's different from their preference, maybe under threat of violence. That's where the second feature becomes important. Having a secret ballot supports election integrity by preventing coercion, so voters can't be forced to cast a ballot with someone else's votes on it. It turns out there are different levels of secrecy too. Simply preventing others from seeing the ballot you've cast is a weaker form of secrecy than making sure no one can prove how you voted, which is a stronger form of secrecy. There is a tension we find between integrity and secrecy. If we wanted to have a perfect count when tallying votes, that would be achievable by attaching every voter's name to their ballot so that everyone could double check at the end that their vote was counted correctly and that someone else didn't change their vote. Unfortunately, as a solution to an integrity problem, it would create a different integrity problem by allowing coercion. Even if voters are casting a ballot in secret, that doesn't mean very much if someone else can later determine how anyone else voted anyway. That tension means we really can't ever have perfect integrity for an election. The technology we use does affect which solutions are available, but ultimately, there are always value decisions that have to be made about where along that spectrum we want election procedures to fall. Remember that the goal of integrity is that the outcome matches voter intent. So, one of the concessions we can make to strike a balance with secrecy is to accept that the vote totals won't be perfectly accurate. There is going to be a margin of error from mistakes in the process, and we should expect some manner of interference. As long as we can mitigate the scale of interference, it may not affect the outcome. And that's fine, actually. What matters is the correct winner be declared, not that the details are necessarily correct. Voter authentication is the reason voters have to be registered to vote. It makes sure only people who are authorized to vote are able to cast a ballot. Even though we don't have the same restrictions on citizens who are allowed to vote that we had until, well, very recent history, we still don't allow minors to vote, and we generally try to avoid foreign states from influencing our elections, so preventing non citizens from voting at least makes them use less direct means of influence. More importantly, though, authentication prevents anyone from voting more than once. The second tension we find has had a lot more attention in public discourse for the last few election cycles, and that's between authentication and enfranchisement, which is the idea that everyone who's authorized to vote should be able to. The US practice of having to file for voter registration in advance of elections rather than enrolling everyone in automatic voter registration once they become eligible does a little bit to secure authorization, but creates a much larger barrier to enfranchisement. In some states, voter registration can even be purged if there has been a sufficiently large gap in time since the last election they voted in. Again, trivially small security for authorization and massive barrier to enfranchisement. The last pillar is availability, which goes in hand with enfranchisement. Elections are held during a specific time frame at particular locations. That should be well communicated to voters, and they should be able to cast their vote at the specified time and place. If a precinct were to close or an election end, say an hour early, both of those would violate the availability of that election. Election security is designed around these features because each of them guards against vectors of attack for disrupting election integrity. That means we can also use each feature as a lens to envision strategies that attackers may use to interfere with elections. The stereotype of election interference is ballot stuffing, where extra votes are inserted artificially for a candidate. But one could also reverse engineer a ballot to find out who cast it and use that as leverage for coercion. Systemic disenfranchisement to prevent certain groups of people from voting is a popular attack these days, and in the last presidential election, many precincts had bomb threats called in, which disrupted availability. When we think about potential attacks on digital voting machines, there is a general distrust across the country because most of us have a vague idea that digital machines are less secure because they can be hacked. But any technology can be hacked, not just digital technology. It's true that there are security concerns unique to digital voting, but that doesn't mean its predecessors were necessarily better. Any unique technology has its own unique flaws. So, to really have a picture of the security flaws in digital voting, we need to understand how that compares to the security flaws in other voting systems that we've used prior to the voting machines of current elections. The methods used to tabulate election results have evolved generally in parallel with modern advances in technology. Even the paper ballot was introduced as a technological solution for integrity problems with voting orally, which is how the earliest US elections were conducted. As computing technology advanced, those new advances continued to be applied to voting systems in attempt to address flaws in the election process. To stop myself from going down an assortment of fascinating tangents, this will be a rough history of voting methods used specifically in US elections. There's more to be said about what the Greeks and Romans did historically. We adopted paper ballots from France after they overthrew the monarchy, and there's a lot we can learn about how modern elections are conducted in other parts of the world, especially India. I'm trying to keep my ADHD in check since I really wanted to at least have this done before Trump's inauguration, and well, here we are. Oral voting was a simple process. The voter would be sworn in by a judge declaring his name, that he is entitled to vote, and that he has not already done so, then announce his votes to an election clerk who would record them in a poll book. There was no secrecy, and elections were carried out in public areas. There was a benefit to the lack of secrecy, which is that vote tallies had a much higher level of verifiability. Since every vote was listed by the name of the person who cast it, they could double check that their vote was recorded correctly, and observers were easily able to maintain independent tallies of the election. It was also prone to bribery and intimidation. Voters would be offered a free meal, alcohol, or just money to vote a certain way. They could also be fired for not voting the same as their employer. There was a lot of physical violence during election time, too. Paper ballots were introduced to the voting process as a method to maintain anonymity in voting. If a ballot couldn't be connected to a specific voter, they couldn't be bribed or intimidated. This was done in the interest of public safety as much as it was for election integrity. When the practice was first adopted, voters brought in their own paper to write their votes on. So the first major advancement of technology for election security in the US was actually the box used to store secret ballots. Ballot boxes featured a slit on the top to insert ballots and a lock on the side so they couldn't be opened during the election. At the start of the election, the box would be opened to demonstrate that there weren't already ballots inside. After the election, the box would either be opened and the ballots counted on the spot, or if it were transported to be counted somewhere else, a wax seal would be placed over the slit to prevent more ballots from being inserted in transit. Because voters would be left alone with the ballot box, it was of course possible to insert extra paper into the box. That's where we get the term ballot stuffing. There were also clever box designs that criminals could use to replace official boxes, such that there were extra ballots hidden behind a secret compartment that could be shaken out after the box was opened for counting. There were advances in ballot box design in response to these problems to allow for figurative and literal transparency, such as iterations of glass ballot boxes. There was even one that featured a ticker to count the number of ballots that had been inserted and a bell that would ring whenever that ticker went up. Voter registration was adopted so that there could be a count of voters who had cast ballots to compare with the number of ballots that had been cast. If those two numbers don't match, that indicates someone has engaged in nefarious business and interfered with the election process. Paper ballots went through similar design iterations themselves. Since voters were expected to provide their own ballot, candidates started providing pre-printed ballots with their names already filled in, with empty space for voters to write in the rest of their votes. Many of these were printed in newspapers as an advertisement. Before long, that led to political parties releasing their own pre-printed ballots with a list of all the party-endorsed candidates for every office in that election. That's where we get the term party ticket from, and the party ticket is a really neat example of how the interface of a ballot can influence votes. On earlier party tickets, there was enough room between candidate names for a voter to cross out a name and write in an opponent's name instead to vote split ticket. But then, parties began printing their tickets with less space printed between names to make it harder to write in split ticket votes. The Australian ballot is the format that stuck around and became the standard still in use today, where the election authority provides every voter with a standardized pre-printed ballot that features a complete list of candidate names that voters could mark privately in the voting booth. The procedures used in the counting process were just as important a set of security features as any part of the voting process. There is one person who removes ballots from the box and calls out the names on the ballot, and a second person who writes down the names called out. These would be done by two separate people so that the person handling the ballots wouldn't have a writing implement to alter the ballots. Interfering with the counting process was just as effective for rigging an election as ballot stuffing. There were some famous instances where observers were forced to leave the counting facility so the counters could just decide the results they wanted and announce that to the public. There were also short pencil artists who would hide a piece of pencil lead underneath a fingernail to add marks to ballots during counting, either inserting a vote onto a section left blank or nullifying a vote for an opposing candidate by overvoting, since ballots would be thrown out if they had marked two candidates for a single seat. Mechanical voting machines entered use in the late 1800s, following from the mechanical adding machines that finally started seeing widespread commercial viability in the 1850s, despite similar designs having existed since the 1600s. Thanks to the advances in manufacturing technology from the Industrial Revolution, the mechanized components could be produced quickly and cheaply enough to make arithmometers available for general use rather than a specialty machine used almost exclusively by mathematicians. That accessibility to new technology eventually led to adapting said technology for specialized use cases, such as voting machines. It's easy to look at this as a natural progression of technological development. There is a new technology, and therefore we have advancing applications for it. But I always feel obligated to challenge that idea when it comes up because we should always be critical of the social forces shaping our technology ecosystem. These machines were designed with the intent of making elections more secure based on the flaws of paper voting, and they were viewed with an assumption of impartiality following from the Enlightenment idea of calculation as an expression of pure objectivity. They did improve election security overall, but not without their own flaws. We'd still be using them otherwise. There was probably also a major element, just like we see today, of looking for applications of a technology after it's been developed. We just tend to remember the applications that were effective and then assume the inverse. Mechanical lever machines were operated by flipping a series of small levers placed next to the name of each candidate. The levers would spin mechanical dials that recorded the number of votes placed for each candidate. Basically, they work the same way as those little hand clickers, but with more complex machinery. They also featured a mechanism that prevented voters from overvoting and invalidating their own ballot. Voters would pull a main lever to close the booth curtain and ready the machine, flip and unflip the small ballot levers as they made their decisions, and once they were ready to cast their ballot, pull the main lever again to submit their selections into the machine and ready the booth for the next voter. The biggest flaw with these machines, just like in present day criticisms of electronic voting machines, was that the machinery kept no record of ballots, just an aggregate count. That meant if there was any damage to the machine that caused the mechanism to fail, there was no way to determine what the correct number of votes would have been, or even how many votes failed to be recorded. The voter also had no way of verifying that their vote had been recorded correctly, since votes were only recorded on dials that were hidden from view. Despite the manufacturers claiming these machines were tamper proof, they were not tamper proof. The mechanism and counting dials were kept under lock and key during voting, but there were still ingenuitive ways to access them and either break a counting dial or jam some pencil lead in between the gears so they wouldn't turn when they were supposed to, but the lead would get worn down and disintegrate. Breaking a piece left evidence that vote totals wouldn't be correct, but if the pencil lead disintegrated, there wouldn't be any reason to think the vote totals were wrong. When electronic computers began emerging in the mid 1900s, the operation of early mainframe computers was sort of analogous in broad strokes to the process used for counting paper ballots. So, at first glance, it might even seem like an ideal technology for vote counting. There was a single central machine that would read information and instructions off of marked punch cards and tabulate results. The punch cards in use at the time were a form of information storage, so a single punch card could be used to record a vote the same way as a written ballot. The major advantage they had over lever operated machines was that they kept a redundant voter record. There was a count that was given from the electronic computers and the physical punch cards that were used to cast votes. The cards were referred to as punch cards because they were marked with holes punched through the card, and when fed into a machine, they would allow electricity to pass through and create a circuit at particular intervals where there were holes in the cards. When used for ballot counting, voters didn't have to have access to the computing apparatus, and more restricted access meant less opportunity for tampering with the counting machine. Perforated cards were inserted into a card holder, and voters would mark their ballot by using a stylus to dislodge chads from the paper, thus punching holes in the card by the candidate names. These cards would later be transported to a central election facility to be counted by a computer. One of the major flaws of punch card ballots comes back to the interface. The punch card itself wasn't easily legible, so they would be inserted into booklet guides that instructed voters on which holes to punch for which candidate. Unfortunately, that design was found to be confusing and misleading for many voters. If candidates are appearing across two pages, we generally read one page at a time, so having the second name appearing on the first page implies the second hole from the top would need to be punched. That wasn't the case, and so more careful attention was needed to read the ballot instructions correctly. There were a lot of ballots thrown out because they had two Chads punched. Voters would punch one hole, realize it was the wrong one, then also punch the correct hole for their preferred candidate. There were also major issues with the cards themselves, which fell under national scrutiny in the 2000 presidential election because Chads can easily have fallen into a partially marked state, either dimpled or still attached on one side, causing them not to have been tallied correctly when fed into the counting machine. Once again, far more directly this time, we see how social forces shape the adoption of technology. Bush v. Gore was an incredibly close election. The Electoral College was won by a single swing state, and Florida's results came down to a difference of just over 500 votes out of 6 million. A month-long legal battle ensued between the two campaigns over getting a recount in the state of Florida, during which time it was discovered that a substantial number of punch card ballots were not punched through completely, with Chads still partially attached to the ballot card. And it's likely that there were enough of these ballots that weren't counted correctly that a hand recount would have altered the result of that election. Because there were compounding problems in that election caused by design flaws of punch card ballots, there was a concerted effort to completely phase out punch card voting systems in favor of optical scan and direct record electronic, or DRE, voting systems. The federal government set aside $3 billion for states to buy DREs, which did not at the time leave a paper trail. As you might imagine, given the federal funding, there was a sudden spike in DRE adoption for the 2004 election. But despite that, optical scanning machines still remained the most popular and continued their steady rise in adoption that had been the trend since the 80s. By 2006, punch card ballots had been entirely phased out of US elections. Today, DREs make up nearly a third of voting machines in use, and scanned paper ballots make up about two-thirds. Optical scan machines first entered polling places in the 1960s, after first being used to grade standardized tests like the ACT and SAT, but weren't widely adopted for elections until the 90s. Optical scanners are operated similarly to punch card computers when counting ballots. The ballot is fed into a counting machine, and an optical sensor is used to determine which bubbles have been filled in. Instead of holes in the page being used to complete a circuit, there's an array of phototransistors coupled with a small light source for consistency that will send a variable amount of electrical current depending on how much light hits the sensor. Anything that appears darker on the page will also pass less light into the sensor. The problem is that the sensor reading needs to be one of two results, even though the light it's measuring is on a spectrum. So there's a specific threshold that's selected on that spectrum. An amount of light below that threshold is counted as marked, and light above that threshold is unmarked. There's a lot of variation in ways people will mark these bubbles, and that makes a huge problem for determining whether a given bubble is marked or left blank, especially considering that graphite and different colors of ink don't all trigger the sensor the same way. Typically, these ballots have instructions to fill out the bubbles completely, but once again, we have a usability issue because people don't always follow directions. Despite this, an X-marked bubble may be read correctly, or it may not be. Once computer form factors got small enough to market the personal computer, taking up far less space than mainframe computers, it became feasible to use DREs essentially as an electronic ballot box, where a voter could cast their vote directly into the computing machine, like the older lever-operated mechanical voting machines, hence the name direct record. One of the original motivations behind adopting DREs was the fact that they were paperless, despite the problems with paperless machines that will be Abundantly clear shortly, this was originally considered an advantage because there wasn't a need to print an obscene number of paper ballots and distribute them to polling places or do something with them after the election. Their displays could also be easily adapted for different accessibility needs, like larger text or non English instructions, without having to print separate ballots for voters who needed them. They also have the advantage over optical scanners that the buttons and touchscreens used on DREs are less prone to usability errors than optical sensors. The lack of a paper trail, however, makes them a black box machine that effectively can't be independently verified. Votes go in, numbers come out, and we fundamentally cannot know for sure what happened in the middle. That idea of a black box is what every concern of digital voting ultimately boils down to. So that's really the major theme of this section. All the problems revolve around that, but so do the solutions to those problems. Even before we get to intentional disruption, just natural mistakes that result from human factors, writing correct software is hard, and bug free software is basically non existent. Is there some kind of weird situation where an odd series of inputs causes the machine to record the wrong results? Maybe, but we just don't know. This is why most election cybersecurity experts actually agree that voting software should be open source. If they are, that means anyone with an interest in election security can examine the code to look for bugs or security vulnerabilities and hopefully get those problems corrected. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it does actually make a lot more sense. Currently, every manufacturer of digital voting machines used in the US operates on a security through obscurity paradigm. The idea, as you might expect, is that the software design and source code should be kept a secret because if election fraudsters don't have access to it, then that limits the vectors of attack that they have available. Unfortunately, if that source code does get leaked, then all the effort that went into protecting it is completely wasted. So we lose out on the benefits from open source software and also lose any benefits of keeping it a secret. It turns out that it's generally a better approach to just assume that adversaries have access to the source code from the moment it goes out into the wild. Circling back to design issues, some of what we covered earlier tends to compound with digital systems. Part of maintaining ballot secrecy entails making sure no one can determine what order the ballots were cast. That's fairly easy when you're dropping separate paper slips into a box, but it's non trivial on digital systems. If every ballot is saved as a separate file, which is an incredibly useful practice for conducting audits, the file names have to be hashed in a non deterministic order. In other words, you can't just name them ballot 1, ballot 2, ballot 3, and so on, or name them according to the time they were cast, since those are two very common strategies for naming a large number of files. That goes as much for the paper trail as it does for anything internal to the software. On DREs with paper validation, those records are typically printed on a roll of cashier's tape, and if they aren't cut in between ballots, now you've got a continuous roll of paper where ballots appear in the order they were cast. Now we finally get to the part where I talk about hacking that machine. And what's the first question any good cybersecurity professional should ask? That's right. Can it play Doom? Yeah, of course it can. I know this sounds frivolous and kind of silly, like running Doom on a pregnancy test. And sometimes it is, like when you run Doom on a pregnancy test. In some cases, it actually is a useful security question. The reason it matters here is that as a meme, it's a typical benchmark to demonstrate that a piece of hardware can be manipulated to run an arbitrary set of software. It's a form of proof that you could also create a separate piece of software designed to look visually identical to the software that's supposed to be running, but manipulate the ballot data in any way that data can be manipulated. You can also design it so that it replaces itself with the correct software at the end of the election and be completely undetectable upon review. To install another set of software, that data needs to be made available to the hardware, which can be done by either connecting a storage drive or via a network. Digital voting machines store their data on external cards, kind of like this one, to transport election results to a central counting facility and use the same cards to load software updates. Just basic things like Which candidates should appear on the ballot this year? If an attacker can get access to the external ports on a voting machine, loading new software can be as seamless as plugging in a different card just long enough to transfer data before putting the other card back. There are some barriers to that. Those ports are covered, typically under lock and key, and usually have tamper evident seals. But locks can be picked, and there are ways to leave a tamper evident seal intact, especially if you have insider access to setting up the equipment. Voting machines that have networking capabilities can transfer data over a network, and that definitely includes the internet. Even though most states require that networking features be turned off during election time, some states do broadcast unofficial results over the internet, and plenty of machines have networking features that aren't used. Any internet connectivity on these machines is a security risk. These kinds of manipulations can record any arbitrary number of votes, whether they were cast or not. They can add or subtract any number from the correct vote count, maybe add 1,000 votes to one candidate and subtract 1,000 from the other, so that the number of votes cast is still correct. And there are always rumors that circulate about voting machines that mark the wrong name when voters press a button. I'd imagine that rumor usually comes down to usability problems rather than hacked software, but again, who knows? Even with paper verification on DREs, they can still record on paper a different candidate than the voter intended. And it turns out there are studies that show even though most voters check the review screen and paper readout, very few will actually catch mistakes upon review, whether malicious or otherwise. These are all fairly big flaws, and for about a decade now, I've stubbornly said that we just shouldn't use digital voting because of them. Period. But if we do, there should at least be a paper trail. Now that I've actually done research on election security and other voting methods, I've come around to thinking machines that scan a physical ballot are the better method. Turns out that's also what most election cybersecurity experts recommend. This is me admitting I've been wrong for a decade. It's an approach that combines technologies so that each is compensating for the other's flaws and takes advantage of redundancy in ballot records. But, and this part is critical, that depends entirely on having good audit procedures. Having both is useless if we don't use both. The auditing procedures are the most important part of verifying the integrity of digital machines, and the gold standard practice is what's called a statistical risk limiting audit, rather than a full recount of paper ballots, where there's a much higher margin of error that we expect compared to digital counting. The paper ballots are partially recounted until a certain confidence threshold is reached, where it's expected that a full recount would yield the same results as the partial recount. Typically, this is done in two steps. The first is actually a machine recount. Since coupling paper ballots with their digital record would violate ballot secrecy, the machine recount both double checks the number from the initial digital count and also creates a pairing of digital records with paper records. The second step is a manual paper count, where a random sample of ballots are counted and the paper records are compared to their digital counterpart for discrepancy. With any major societal event, especially those that force us to think about the uncertainty of the future, there is a collective process of sense-making that naturally follows. What a novel idea that people want to make sense of the world around them. We tend to be less concerned, though, with building an accurate and robust understanding of the outside world as we are with maintaining an internally consistent worldview. That's simply a matter of cognitive efficiency. Our brains are designed to process the world based on shortcuts and heuristics, since we don't have the capacity to process all the stimuli available to us. It's basically the same for sense making as it is for inattentional blindness. You've seen the invisible gorilla video, right? One of the shortcuts we tend to reach for is the formation and propagation of conspiracy theories. The term conspiracy theory is mostly associated these days with the kind of fictitious speculation typically far divorced from reality like Pizzagate. But as a category, the term also refers to speculating on real conspiracies that did actually happen. There are plenty of conspiracy theories about the CIA, ranging from assassination attempts on Fidel Castro to experiments on using psychedelic drugs for mind control and telekinesis, that are confirmed to be true thanks to declassified documents. There's a range of conspiracy theories that have been generated about the results of the last presidential election. Some of the conspiracy theories are completely bogus, and some of them are at least plausible. The earlier theory that began spreading on Twitter and TikTok alleges that Starlink internet satellites were used to alter vote tallies on internet connected voting machines. That's where the Starlink theory begins and ends. There's not really any substance to it, which makes it easier to spread and harder to dissuade people from believing. People tend to be convinced more by the accusation than the reasoning behind it. We'll get into that more in the next section. So, it maybe even has had an easier time spreading because it lacks substantive attempts to demonstrate plausibility. Unfortunately, it's also a lot harder to debunk claims that lack substance because there's no foothold for argumentation, nothing detailed enough to explain what's wrong about it specifically. Short of trying to explain how election systems work, like I'm doing here, you wind up with articles trying to debunk claims of election fraud that just don't have much to say other than the claims are unfounded and there was no evidence of malicious activity that affected the election integrity. Just claiming there was no evidence really deserves to be unpacked. At least use that as an opportunity to inform people about election security and how officials look for that evidence. Honestly, the most upsetting part of researching all this was seeing every single article trying to restore whatever faith they could in our election process, saying that voting machines don't connect to the internet, without elaborating at all or even acknowledging that don't and can't are not the same thing. With that out of the way, it's time for the main event, the thing that you came here for, the speculation from people who probably know what they're talking about. There are 3 open letters that I'm aware of from security experts asking for hand recounts or investigations into potential election fraud for the 2024 presidential election. These letters, in publication order, were written by Duncan Buell et al., Stephen Spoonamore, and Raymond Lutz. There are substantial differences between the arguments each of these letters make. However, each of them is predicated on a series of security breaches on digital voting infrastructure in the months following the 2020 presidential election. On January 7, 2021, the day after right-wing insurrectionists stormed the U.S. Capitol, a team of operatives for Atlanta-based data solutions company Sullivan Strickler were given unauthorized access to digital election equipment by election officials in Coffee County, Georgia. They had been hired by a team of Trump's lawyers under direction of Sidney Powell to conduct forensic reviews of said election equipment as part of legal investigations into Trump's ongoing claims of election interference. And the Sullivan Strickler team, believing they had proper authorization to do so, made forensic images of nearly every piece of the county's voting system, effectively copying all the data and software on every piece of digital equipment used in the voting process. This data was then distributed to members of Trump's campaign team and potentially used to develop exploits for manipulating the software in ways that would be advantageous for digital ballot stuffing. I'm sorry, I have to acknowledge the irony of using claims of election fraud as pretext in committing election fraud. This data breach was uncovered in deposition for a federal suit over the security of Georgia's voting systems in the 2020 presidential election. Subsequent court filings and information requests revealed that in weeks prior, Sullivan Strickler had done the same in Michigan and Nevada. Similarly, Wake Technology Services was contracted by Powell to conduct a recount and audit of the election results in Maricopa County, Arizona, and Fulton County, Pennsylvania. Both audits caused the respective counties to have their election machines decertified and unusable in later elections. Fulton County had to pay $25,000 to replace their machines for a municipal election in May of 2021. Mesa County, Colorado election official Tina Peters was indicted by a grand jury and sentenced to 9 years in prison for official misconduct, among other charges, after breaching security protocols and exceeding permissible access to voting equipment. A copy of Mesa County's voting system hard drive, as well as passwords to that voting system, were distributed online over social media. For more than 3 years, Trump's campaign team has had access to highly restricted software from Dominion Voting Systems and Electronic Systems and Software (ES&S), the two largest voting system vendors in the country, between them constituting the vast majority of voting machines used in every swing state, making this the most severe election security breach known to the public since the advent of electronic voting. Each of the three open letters argues that this is reason in itself to be suspicious of the election integrity and is cause to investigate possible election interference. This exact situation is also a perfect example of why security by obscurity is a poor long term strategy for protecting elections. The Boyle et al. Letter advocated for Vice President Harris to call a hand recount of votes in a majority of swing states, which didn't happen. Audits were conducted as normal in the most scrutinized states. However, the letter argues that Arizona is the only swing state that has strong enough audit laws to effectively correct any problem in vote counts. Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin don't require that audits be conducted before the votes are certified, and Georgia's audits are non binding. Therefore, this letter points out the only guarantee for a rigorous audit of the election results is a hand recount that can only be requested by the candidate. And I'd really like to remind you, dear viewer, for emphasis, that all of this completely defeats the purpose of even having audits in the first place. The Lutz letter was addressed to the Department of Justice, urging them to initiate an investigation of possible election fraud. This letter cites the same concerns as the Boyle et al. Letter. However, rather than emphasizing the audit process, Lutz pointed out that because Harris did not challenge the election results before the deadline, there were few remaining options to even determine the level of interference that occurred in last year's election. Public trust in elections is waning, and it will only continue to do so without adequate checks on the election process that is effectively communicated to the public. In addition to the known security breaches, Lutz also mentioned anomalous statistics in voting data, focusing on the amount of ballot drop-off in Nevada. Drop-off here referring to the difference in participation for the presidential race compared to down-ballot races. Over recent elections, drop-off was small overall and fairly consistent between both parties. In 2016, the difference in drop-off between parties was almost negligible. This actually came as a surprise to me. Personally, I would expect Trump supporters to have had higher than normal drop-off in most parts of the country. Part of that comes from my own impressions of public discourse and how I see Trump supporters talk about politics online, but that may still be skewed by my own experience doing campaign work in Tennessee, and I did a lot of campaign work in Tennessee last year. There is a very large set of voters that I spoke with who just wanted to cast a ballot for Trump and didn't care about the other races that appeared on their ticket. In 2020, there was more drop off across the board, which is to be expected from an election with the highest percent of voter turnout since 1900, and slightly more drop off from Democratic voters, which fits with the narrative that a large contingent of voters were voting against Trump more than they were voting for Democrats. In 2024, there was a similar amount, but slightly less drop off of Democratic voters than 2020, and Republican drop off more than doubled. Even expecting Trump to elicit more drop off from his voters, I would still not expect the difference to be that dramatic, especially in contrast with the drop off of 2016. It is important at this point to remind you, dear viewer, as Lutz also states in this letter, that this is neither proof nor evidence of election interference. Not in Nevada, where this data is localized to, and especially not nationwide. This is, at most, an oddity that warrants examination alongside other causes for suspicion. It may be statistically anomalous, but weird things happen sometimes, and outliers exist. There are reasonable explanations for these results to have happened organically. Along with the point of shifts and drop-off, Lutz's letter also acknowledges circulating claims about a high number of bullet ballots, which were cast with only a vote for Trump on an otherwise unmarked ballot. And this letter claims there has not been substantial evidence that the number of single vote ballots cast only for Trump was especially high. We'll circle back to the bullet ballots in just a minute because that thread of discussion was originally brought up in the Spoonamore letter. Of the three, I think this was probably the most widely circulated letter online, and I suspect that's in large part because it crafts a narrative of what a possible attack might have looked like, rather than just pointing out causes for suspicion, as we see in the other two letters. Starting from claims about anomalous statistics, namely high rates of bullet ballots, the letter describes how a possible digital ballot stuffing operation could have happened. That operation is predicated on access to the software used in tabulating votes, since anyone with that access could have the ability to manipulate the calculated vote totals. As we discussed earlier, that software is just out in the wild now. But if changing the final tally were the entire attack, that would be fairly easy to catch even before an audit. If the vote total is even 1,000 votes more than the number of people who voted in a given precinct, it's pretty obvious that there's been some interference. So, to avoid detection, a sufficiently effective attempt at introducing fake ballots would also require inserting fake voter records. On October 6, 1 month before the election, America PAC launched a petition for registered voters to pledge their support for the First and Second Amendments, accompanied by an offer to pay $47 for every registered voter referred to sign the petition. This offer was open exclusively to people registered to vote in one of the 7 swing states. America PAC was formed 4 months ahead of the election by famously cringe billionaire Elon Musk so that he could personally finance the Trump campaign, totaling $75 million of contributions directly from Musk. The week following the petition's launch, the payment offer for registering voters was raised specifically for Pennsylvania voters from $47 to $100, and Musk announced there would be a daily $1 million giveaway every day until the voter registration deadline, to be selected, of course, from those who had signed the petition. Musk's stated goal was to collect 1 to 2 million signatures from voters in swing states. On today's episode of Rules Don't Apply to Billionaires, there was zero practical reason for him to care about the legality of any part of this operation. Despite litigations in court about the $1 million giveaway, nothing in the court system would have ever moved fast enough to stop illegal activity. Just sentence a punishment after the fact, the maximum penalties for which would be a $10,000 fine or a few years in prison, neither of which Musk would really have had any reason to care about. It's also illegal, according to federal election law, to pay people to register to vote. Musk ham-fistedly avoided that problem by paying them to sign the petition that says they're registered to vote and paying people to refer other registered voters. There are no consequences within the legal system that would have mattered in this situation. Since America PAC's petition generated a list of registered voters in swing states and was framed to skew overwhelmingly conservative, the Spoonamore letter alleges that such a list would be tremendously useful for inserting ghost voters. Even though ballot machines should not be connected to the internet, poll book data almost always is. That means even though it requires at least a somewhat sophisticated attack to change the vote tallies, changing the record of which people have cast a ballot would be fairly easy using a typical man in the middle attack. The skew toward conservative voters on the list makes it easy for someone inserting votes in Trump's favor to mark corresponding voter records of likely Trump supporters who had not cast ballots. The Spoonamore letter also speculates briefly that the series of bomb threats called into voting precincts on Election Day, which are known to have all originated from Russian operatives, could have been coordinated with other operations. The bomb threats forced a break in standard operating procedure for those precincts and disrupted chain of custody for ballots and their records. If the bomb threats were related, that would be useful pretext to prevent hand recounting. That said, even if the bomb threats weren't coordinated with other operations, they did still disrupt the election procedures and chain of custody for those precincts. There was some fact-checking that was published in response to the Spoonamore letter. Snopes reviewed his claims along with other election fraud claims that we come to expect every presidential cycle. The fact-check they did is correct. Spoonamore even admitted in a later blog post that he had made some errors, but the Snopes article focuses specifically on the bullet ballot claims as a specific form of undervote ballot where every field except the presidential race is left blank. While it's good to be more precise about factuality in general, and especially here, the article also implies that the entirety of Spoonamore's claims are unfounded on the basis of errors in his claims about bullet ballots. But the article also doesn't engage closely with the bulk of claims made in the Spoonamore letter or acknowledge other anomalous statistics that have been alleged by others. The lack of clarity in that exchange feels like the perfect segue right now into the next section. Most people, upon seeing information like this, are not going to invest multiple weeks of research investigating every facet of speculation and allegations they can dig up. Generally, people do what I almost did, which is make a snap judgment based on minimal information because it fits readily into the narrative they use to understand the world. As I mentioned in our discussion of digital voting, I have tended not to trust digital voting by default, and knowing that fascism seeks power by whatever means available, this landed neatly into my worldview. I was fully prepared to just accept as truth that there was substantial evidence indicating likely election interference without bothering to think critically about that claim. Instead, I realized I could farm this for views by talking about it on the internet, and subsequently proceeded down the aforementioned weeks-long rabbit hole to make a video. When I decided to write on this, my first set of questions came down to what are the truths here that I am able to verify, and based on the set of knowable facts that are available to me, what speculation still seems plausible? Those are the kinds of questions that ideally we would all be thinking about every time we're presented with new information, but that's just not how our brains are designed to process new information. It's too cognitively taxing to be on high alert to every single piece of information we see, especially when the social internet has adapted to become an informational fire hose. There are a lot of ways our brains rely on shortcuts for processing, and incorporating new information into a semi coherent worldview is very much on that list. Propaganda and disinformation work by hijacking those shortcuts. This may surprise you, but people get things wrong sometimes, often by mistake. Thankfully, a lot of things we're wrong about are fairly innocuous. Did you know humans only use 10% of our brains? I hear people say that so much, it must be true. When I was a teenager, one of my scout leaders told me that you lose most of your body heat through the top of your head. That sounded kind of weird to me, but he usually knew what he was talking about, so I figured it was probably right. I then spent the rest of my teenage years confidently telling other people that fun fact, even though it wasn't actually a fact, getting increasingly ridiculous with some myths that were real bangers on the playground in elementary school. And as a martial artist, I love these in particular. Black belts have to register their hands as lethal weapons. No. If you hit the base of someone's nose at the right angle, it'll jam the nose bone up into their brain and kill them instantly. Except that the bridge of your nose is made of cartilage, not bone, and isn't rigid enough to damage anything else. Did I continue to believe this into adulthood? Yes, until I took an anatomy and physiology class in college. Did this make me scared shitless of getting hit in the nose as a kid? Abso-fucking-lutely it did. My favorite is the myth that dogs can't look up, which originated from a throwaway gag in Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah, well, Big Al also says dogs can't look up.
The best part about that one is that I remember seeing an interview clip years ago where Simon Pegg was talking about that line and said that he tried looking it up to see if there were already people claiming dogs couldn't look up, couldn't find any evidence of such a myth. Years after the movie released, he started seeing people repeating that myth in earnest, so that film probably actually started that myth. There is a deep irony here, though, because I spent hours trying to find that interview again and could not for the life of me dig up anything even tangentially related. Does it actually exist? Did I completely make this up in my head and somehow remember it as fact? Who the fuck even knows? Thinking about our fuzzy relationship with truth is making my grasp on reality feel like it's turning to sand between my fingers anyway. Each of these examples demonstrates a different mechanism in the spread of false information. Sometimes it's as simple as repetition. If you hear something repeated enough times, it becomes easier to accept as true. Sometimes we hear things from a source that we trust to be correct and are less critical because of that trust. Usually, when things are emotionally charged, that takes precedence over rational thinking. And sometimes it's just a matter of saying, I think I heard that somewhere once. When we expand on this to see how the information ecosystem is manipulated to intentionally mislead people, we have to understand that information learning and understanding are social phenomena, not individual. The information that is available to us and the processes we use to understand it are both shaped by people who share it with us. In case that isn't apparent enough from the previous examples, we also have this neat little thing called the conformity bias to really drive it home. In a group setting, people will often commit to things they know to be factually incorrect to instead conform to the social majority. There's a classic psychology experiment where 8 participants in a room together are handed a paper with a series of lines and are asked to select which of the 3 lines on the right are the same length as the 1 line on the left. Stupid simple, except that 7 of the 8 group members are planted actors. In the experimental group, all 7 of the research stooges pick the same wrong answer. Turns out, about a third of study participants changed their answer to match the other group members. Now, some of you might hear this and think, oh, these stupid sheeple need to just learn to think for themselves. And if you've come to that conclusion, kindly shut the fuck up, you pretentious ass. Sometimes it's good for people to second guess themselves. Consider when you've encountered inverse situations where one person is very confidently wrong and made it everyone else's problem. Even just as a matter of statistics, if you've got a group of people who aren't confident about an answer, the more people you have guessing the same thing, the more likely it is to be correct. On the beloved trivia game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The most effective lifeline was Ask the Audience, which turned out to yield the correct answer about 90% of the time. The goal of public disinformation is not the inverse of correctly informing the public. It's not about getting people to believe a specific thing that happens to be wrong. The details of any belief held by targets of disinformation is a byproduct. The goal of disinformation is to sow social division, mistrust, confusion, and general chaos in the target population. It is not a precision instrument. There are a few different groups instigating disinformation to affect US political environment, namely domestic fascist agitators and adversarial nations, including but not exclusively Russia. Realistically, there are probably also US government agencies still running some disinformation campaigns on its own citizens, as that's something they've been known to do in the past. Fascist agitators and Russian operatives generally seem to use similar strategies for similar purposes. Fascism relies on othering social groups and stoking political unrest to legitimize their use of political violence. Foreign adversaries want to generally weaken our national security, and they achieve that by debilitating the power of democratic institutions. For example, by dissolving public trust in things like the election process. Both of those ends are achieved by fracturing social stratifications and driving wedges into the growing divisions of culture. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia was actively spurring on the wave of vaccine denialism, which had an obvious impact on the health of our nation in basically every sense of the word. If you were on the internet in 2018, you might remember this viral video: feminist pours bleach on a man-spreading subway passenger. It was staged Russian propaganda, and boy, it sure made people upset. Remember all the people you argued with about it online? Okay, maybe you didn't, but you definitely at least saw other folks getting real heated about it. Manufactured outrage becomes a lot more literal when you realize how much of it is produced in a factory on an assembly line. It's really easy to hear this and think it should be easy to shield yourself as long as you're good enough at discerning false from true information. That does help, but no matter how good your critical skills are, you will never be as good at that discernment as you think. Building an awareness will never stop you from being susceptible. The other problem is that disinformation doesn't necessarily need to be false. It just needs to affect your frame of thinking. Talking about that subway video in terms of factuality is orthogonal to what that video was doing. There was a woman who poured something on a guy's lap. It invoked emotional responses because of the way it was framed. There is specific Russian disinformation that I know I've fallen for. So, to drive home that you are not immune to propaganda, I'm pointing out by example that I'm not immune either. I've got an old college buddy who works in military intelligence, and when I was running for office last year, I reached out to him for help with messaging about online disinformation, since monitoring disinformation is a big part of his day job. One of the examples he reached for in that conversation was the invasion of Ukraine. It made an easy example since Russia can weaken a country's military defenses by diluting the amount of aid they're able to get from the US, and having our population view Ukraine less favorably leads to us giving them less support. Rather than telling me anything directly, he asked a series of leading questions that started with what things I knew generally about the conflict. One of the things I mentioned was that the Azov Battalion, a neo Nazi militia that was integrated into Ukraine's National Guard, had been a key force in driving back the invasion and used that to gain political power in the country. I was then asked how I knew that. The answer mostly was leftist discourse on Twitter, and I immediately realized the reason I knew that was because the Kremlin wanted me to. The actual truth is kind of orthogonal to the goal. Even assuming it is true, putting that information in front of enough people changes the frame of cultural support. So that brings up another important question we should be asking: who benefits from me thinking this? Reporting that's come out since I had stopped paying attention to the conflict indicates that leadership had been actively rooting out white supremacists from the battalion. I don't imagine that's ever work that can be completed, but the organization's politics have at least changed drastically since its founding. So, this is me a second time in one video admitting I've been wrong about things. Ladies, get yourself a man with these green flags. I do not keep my hair this luxurious using 2-in-1. Leftists on the internet are stereotypically known for hating each other and being too busy with infighting to engage in productive activism. What I see from leftists online could not be further from almost any experience I've had with other leftist organizers offline in my community and around the state. We have a habit of letting criticism become a barrier to coalition building, and that's really easy for fascists to take advantage of. The day after Trump was inaugurated in 2017, the last time he got sworn in, nearly 500,000 people marched in DC to demonstrate opposition to his administration, coordinated with upwards of 4 million others marching around the country. At the time, the Women's March was the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. Launching from widespread attention of the initial demonstration, the leaders of the Women's March formally established a nonprofit organization whose legacy of engaging mass support was almost eclipsed by their very public implosion in 2019. The movement and organization were widely criticized by progressive activists for various forms of non-inclusivity. The pink hats that symbolized the movement also quickly became synonymous with a brand of liberal white feminism that used a defanged approach to activism, prioritizing spectacle over substance. One of the founders, Linda Sarsour, is a Palestinian woman whose activist career had primarily focused on safety for Muslim Americans in the aftermath of 9/11 and protesting the Zionist occupation of Palestine. In a move that is far more recognizable with the increased attention Israel's occupation has gotten over the last couple years, Sarsour's activism for a liberated Palestine was rhetorically conflated with anti-Semitism. Some of the criticisms toward the Women's March were valid and worthwhile criticisms. Some of them were fabrications. And I am not going to take the time to relitigate any of them because all of them were used as tools to impede and fracture progressive organizing. The claims that were fabricated were used to artificially create barriers between any differences in ideology that could be leveraged. The valid criticisms, which could have been constructive for the sake of strengthening coalitions, were amplified and redirected to become destructive, breaking apart existing solidarity. That's a matter of framing rather than of fact. It is easy enough to make a sock puppet account that looks like someone of any demographic. Trolls from 4chan did that often enough during Gamergate to tweet out hashtag not your shield and have absolutely kept it up to fuck with their opponents. Russian leaders have bragged that only 1% of their bot accounts get caught, and look, we don't know, but based on their entire history, surely the CIA is running online psyops to impede leftist organizing. I'm begging my fellow leftists, please stop engaging with dipshit takes like these. Most of them are obvious psyops. I don't care whether bringing food to your neighbor is ableist was ever a good faith take made by a real person. Don't prioritize arguing about inane shit on the internet over doing real organizing that materially helps people offline. And for God's sakes, more of us need to recognize that part of building community is letting other people build community with you. By this point, I hope it's obvious why I think claims about Starlink being used to hack into voting machines were clearly directed by Russian trolls. Those claims started emerging on Twitter during a period where people were desperately looking for explanations to help them make sense of the election results. And most of the accounts propagating that claim had the kind of small follower count that's typical of sock puppets. Public trust in election integrity is decreasing steadily, and claims in any direction about election interference, especially insubstantiated claims, necessarily degrade that trust. That degradation of trust is the reason I thought it was important to include this section on disinformation. It is important that I demonstrate the necessity of caution when approaching the topic of election integrity. And even when unpacking more substantive claims, I think it would be irresponsible of me to engage in this discussion publicly without at least acknowledging the position it takes within the broader information ecosystem. However likely you come away from this believing the election was hacked in Trump's favor, at least keep in mind that there is no smoking gun, and there is no definitive proof of any vote tallies having been artificially manipulated, even if Trump has himself alluded to it a handful of times. There is very good reason to be suspicious, but that doesn't mean there was necessarily foul play, and even if it was attempted, doesn't necessarily mean it was successful or had a meaningful impact on election integrity. The existence of a vulnerability is not proof that it has been exploited. An attempted exploitation is not necessarily a successful attempt, and even if there were a successful attempt, the same outcome might have still happened anyway. So, a lot's happened since I started writing this at the end of November, and of course, the way I've been thinking about the subject matter here has shifted substantially along with the evolving political climate. Ironically, that shift, I think, solidified the conclusions I was initially leaning toward. At this point, I don't think it really matters much whether there was substantial election interference or not. What does matter is considering how the information I've presented here affects the frame of reference you're using to contextualize the current political moment. For me, Musk has made enough other unrestrained power grabs that it fits a clean pattern, and I was less surprised to see them happening based on the research I'd already done for this video. Based on what he's done since, I would expect that he would have exercised whatever power was available to him to influence the election so that he could set himself up to do exactly what he's been doing since Trump took office. The reason I've let go of concerns about the factuality is that I found myself thinking of it a bit like Schrodinger's cat, simultaneously true and untrue, because I don't think we'll ever know definitively. If it's true, then we should consider this as one of many strategies of gaining power used by the growing contingent of fascist politicians to whom holding that power is the only thing that matters. And if it's untrue, then we should consider the systemic failings of the Democratic Party as an institution in halting fascism's rise to power. Neither of those are counter to the other idea, regardless of whether there was a degree of interference large enough to change the election outcome. Those are still both important considerations. Given the surrounding political context of all the other abuses of power, I don't think this is something that's useful to fixate on specifically if it is true. Just one of many tiles in the mosaic of contemporary political turmoil. It is difficult to make sense of a world that is continuously getting worse for everyone except the most powerful. And the election result is simultaneously a large singular event that is easy to distinguish along a chain of descent into fascism and is a small power play compared to the others we've seen since, that all accelerate the decaying material conditions of our society. There is comfort in reaching for a simple frame of reference instead of facing the weight of complexity in the world. And for instances like this, a lot of that comfort is grounded by faith in government institutions and a hope that if it's proven to be true that the election was rigged in Trump's favor, it would somehow become a silver bullet that leads our government systems to self correcting away from authoritarianism. Things do not make sense right now. And if we've learned anything about our changing political landscape over the last decade, it should be that things are not going to make sense. Fascism thrives in political disarray, which they actively cause in part by poisoning the informational well. There are so many vectors of weaponized disinformation that will only continue to get worse. As murky as our informational landscape is now, in the future, it may never be as clear again as it is now. If we spend our energy on sense making, that detracts from us focusing on things that are clear and important to respond to. We don't know whether Musk tampered with the vote counts, but we do know that he's been systemically dismantling government agencies and services from the inside out in an ongoing bureaucratic coup. Looking to past events that led to the current moment can help us make sense of what's happening now. But ultimately, what matters is responding to the current moment, especially given how quickly our problems are escalating. We cannot keep hoping for the institutions that continue giving way to fascism and consolidating power to do anything but that. There are no saviors from on high. Our only solutions are through grassroots organizing, working in coalitions toward common goals, and building unity amongst the working class. Trust in electoral systems continues to degrade, but I think that matters less as that trust is further eroded. That's not to say electoral politics and legislative activism aren't important. They are, but because of their consolidation of power, that work is harm reduction above all else. There are good people holding elected positions of power who are genuinely doing their best to help, but to do so, they are necessarily fighting against a system that is designed to stop them. The weaponization of bureaucratic systems and now expedient power grabs taking place faster than those systems can respond are tools of the powerful to maintain oppression. They should be met with resistance when wielding those tools, but we should keep in mind that doing so is a defensive strategy. Collective liberation cannot be achieved just by playing defense. And the most effective tool we have is collective action that operates orthogonally to systems of oppression, disrupting the institutions that uphold them and engaging in mutual aid to support the communities that are being impacted the most. Even the smallest forms of resistance are more important now than they have ever been in our lifetimes.